Welcome, class, to Constitutional Law 475. Today we will continue going over discrimination, and we're going to focus on race discrimination. And we will start by discussing Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. Okay, so Natalie, you have grown up in the Alabama school system here in the heart of the South. What do you know about Plessy versus Ferguson? Nothing, really. That's surprising. You know, I grew up in Southern California, and we learned about Cesar Chavez. We learned about other things, you know, because curricula are different from state to state. That's interesting that you haven't covered Plessy versus Ferguson in school. All right. Well, okay, Plessy versus Ferguson looked at the constitutionality of a state law in Louisiana that required railroad cars to be segregated. Okay? Now, Plessy was 1/8 African American, right? And he wasn't happy about this law. A lot of people that were concerned about civil rights for African Americans were not happy about this law. Guess who else was not happy about this law?
Plucky.
Who? It's Plessy versus Ferguson. Whoever Plucky was, he wasn't pleased either. But anyway, gather yourself. Plessy wasn't happy about this law. A lot of groups that were concerned with civil rights weren't happy about this law. Anyone here want to help me out? Who else was not happy about this law, do you think? That required the railroad industry to have separate cars for blacks and whites. The railroad industry! There you go. That's from my dear wife, thinking like an efficient person.
Hey!
The railroad industry was not happy about this. Why not?
Because it costs more money.
It costs them more money. Absolutely. It is inefficient. I know this is Sunday, and I don't want to go on a rant about this, but this is one of the things that amazes me about the South is how inefficient it is, and I think a lot of it goes back to Plessy. So, in this case, like I said, the state of Louisiana required railroads, the train industry, to maintain separate cars for whites and blacks. Plessy was 1/8 black, so he and some others purposely challenged the law. They purposely orchestrated Plessy getting arrested. Case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld the state law.
Are you serious?
I am serious.
What year was this?
1896.
Boo.
Yeah, boo. 1896, and the court said a number of interesting things. Number one, most importantly when it comes to the Equal Protection Clause, they said separate facilities as long as they are somewhat similar do not violate the Equal Protection Clause. So as long as the facilities and opportunities were somewhat similar, the Equal Protection Clause permitted the separation of the races. And this is what led to the separate but equal doctrine, right? And basically introduced Jim Crow laws throughout the South. So Justice Harlan, in his dissent, uttered some of the most famous words ever spoken by the court. He said, "Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. But that was in dissent. The majority ruled otherwise, 7-1. And basically, they were deferring to the state on that one. Okay, so a number of you have had me for other classes, but let's just discuss this concept for a minute. According to the state of Louisiana, what was their legal justification for having separate rail cars for blacks and whites?
I have no idea, but it doesn't seem logical. But I would say they would tell them that the people wanted it that way.
That's just what the majority wanted?
Yep. At the time.
Remember, you basically... You can try that argument. There are better arguments, though. No offense. There are better arguments. Don't have to roll your eyes. But the better argument is it falls within a state's police powers. A state's police powers are very broad, and they allow the state to protect the health, safety, and welfare of its citizens. So, the U.S. Supreme Court asked the state of Louisiana, why do you have this law? If you're the state of Louisiana, you say it's a legitimate exercise of our police powers. We are just trying to protect the health, safety, and welfare of our citizens, and we think the health, safety, and welfare of our citizens will be improved if we have separate rail cars for blacks and whites.
Boo.
Yeah, and the court deferred to the state.
Wimps.
Yeah, so that's one of the court's most infamous rulings, Plessy versus Ferguson, and it was used to justify all the Jim Crow laws that followed after that. Okay, that was 1896. Then Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, they started to mount an orchestrated attack on the Plessy decision, right? And so they started off by going after low-hanging fruit, right? Do you know what low-hanging fruit means?
Stuff that's easy to get to.
Stuff that's easy to get to, yeah. Where you know you're going to win, right? So, in Plessy versus Ferguson, the court said as long as the opportunities and facilities are somewhat similar, then the races are allowed to be separated. So, if you're Thurgood Marshall, what do you go after? What's the low-hanging fruit?
I don't know.
Nancy, Michael, anyone who's listening to my conversation?
No one cares. I'm kidding.
Okay, the low-hanging fruit is situations where the facilities and opportunities clearly are not somewhat similar, where it is obvious that minorities are being denied certain opportunities. Right? Okay, so that takes us to Missouri X-Rail Gaines versus Canada, 1938.
They're fighting against Canada?
No. And this one was 7-2. So Gaines was a black Missouri resident, and he applied for admission to the University of Missouri Law School. He was denied admission solely because of his race. In other words, he was qualified to get in, should have gotten in, but was denied admission because of his race. Missouri did not have a law school for its black citizens, so it offered to send qualified black students to law school in a neighboring state that did not have segregationist policies. So we'll send you to a state that doesn't segregate the races. But we do, in Missouri, segregate the races, and we don't have a law school for blacks. So we'll send you to another state with non-segregationist policies.
What if I want to live in this one?
Well, exactly. So, in what kind of ways are you disadvantaged if you do not have the choice of staying in state or going out of state?
Well, let's say I have property there. You're taking away my property. You're taking away my family connections.
Well, wait. Let's reason clearly here.
Okay.
I'm not necessarily taking away your property.
Well, in a sense you are. What if I need to make money to keep it, and the only way to do that is get through law school?
Anyway, you're clearly disadvantaged if you have to go out of state to go to school because you don't have the choice of staying in state or going out of state. You have to go out of state. So if you had stayed in state, the possibility exists you could have saved money on housing. You could have saved money on childcare if you needed it. You would have saved money on transportation. You would have saved money on a lot of things because going out of state to go to school is more expensive than staying in state in a lot of ways. Now, some students choose to go out of state because they want to get away from home or have a different experience or whatever. But the whole point in Missouri XRL Gaines versus Canada is blacks weren't given that choice. They had to go out of state if they wanted to go to law school. So the court concluded the out-of-state tuition plan was unconstitutional. At that point, the state then moved to establish a law school for blacks at Lincoln. So with this ruling, basically the court served notice that segregation policies were about to undergo close evaluation. So remember, this case was heard in 1938. Plessy versus Ferguson was 1896. So basically from 1896 to 1938 was the court just turning a blind eye to a lot of situations where blacks were disadvantaged.
Yes, they were.
Yes, they were. And that's the point, right? Is for a lot of the time, school for blacks, school for whites, the school for blacks is really inferior. They were just turning a blind eye to it, right? But with this ruling, they were serving notice to the states that unless the facilities are somewhat similar, we're going to strike them down, the facilities and opportunities, right? So this is kind of a shot across the bow of the states, so to speak. Okay, so that takes us to Sweat versus Painter, 1950. This one was unanimous, 9-0, right?
Yay.
Well, there you go. So in 1946, Sweat applied for admission to the University of Texas Law School. All right. What do you know about the University of Texas Law School? Good or bad?
It's not as good as Texas A&M.
Well, yeah, there you go. Spoken like the daughter of an Aggie. But yeah, but unfortunately A&M doesn't have a law school.
Dang it.
Yeah, I know. So the University of Texas Law School has an outstanding reputation, actually. It can properly be called one of the ranking law schools in the nation. It's a lot of money goes to University of Texas and Texas A&M. Texas A&M is where I got my PhD. Trust me, there's a lot of money, a lot of resources. So in 46, Sweat applied for admission to the University of Texas Law School. His application was denied based on race. Now, there was no Texas law school that admitted blacks, so he filed suit demanding that the University of Texas admit him. Okay, Natalie.
Yes.
Now, you are thinking about going to law school
at
some point, right? So, does Sweat have a strong case after Missouri XRL Gaines versus Canada?
Yes, because they've made that decision in the past, so it should apply to him because he doesn't have that opportunity.
Very good. Excellent. So, a trial court judge realized that Sweat had a very strong case, given the precedent from Missouri XRL Gaines versus Canada. So, you guys ready for a little Texas politics? the trial court judge continued the case for 6 months to allow the state time to address the problem. So he just held up the case for 6 months.
Nice.
Right? So the state threw together a law school, and it was set to open in February 1947. Then a permanent black law school was later to open in Houston. So, because of this, the judge said, hey, there's going to be a black law school. A permanent one's going to open in Houston. Your case is dismissed. Right? Problem's been solved.
It's not the same.
I know. So
been thrown together. You could have a house. You could have 4 wooden posts and a sheet metal over it. It's always the same thing. It's shelter. Shelter is shelter.
Right, exactly. Now that's a good argument. Now he appealed, case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that this situation was not equal. Not even close, right? So you made a good comparison with the 4 posts and a piece of sheet metal compared to a house. Well, they're both shelter. Here you go. The court said, yeah, that's basically what the state of Texas has done here with these law schools is, hey, see this one we threw together overnight? It's the same as this one that's one of the best law schools in the nation. The Supreme Court said no. So name some ways law schools are better than others. Funding.
Professors and teachers.
Absolutely. Qualification.
Resources.
Yeah.
Connection. Location. Okay.
Yeah. And faculty prestige,
yeah.
Which you hit on, faculty size.
Mm-hmm.
Where they have a law review or not, a number of resources, books, moot court, all that type of stuff. So the court said, as I said earlier, the University of Texas may properly be considered one of the nation's ranking law schools. So was that a huge victory for civil rights activists?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. And again, it's a disturbing case in some ways because it tells you where a lot of people in positions of power were at the time, right? The trial judge held that case up for 6 months. And it's a good old boy network, right? When he's like, I got this case, the guy's gonna win based on precedent, so you guys better throw together a law school overnight. That conversation occurred in some back room, or who knows, maybe even over dinner in 1940s in Texas. Who knows? But that conversation occurred, which is disturbing. But anyway, the court got it right, in my humble opinion. Said these facilities, these opportunities are not somewhat similar, and ruled for Sweatt. Okay, now that takes us to McLaurin versus Oklahoma State Regents, 1950. This one was also 9-0. So, to comply with judicial decisions, the University of Oklahoma admitted black graduate students when these students could not obtain the desired degrees at minority schools. Right? So, something that a lot of people forget or aren't aware of is that a lot of the time, graduate programs are not very big. I got my PhD at Texas A&M, and guess how many students were in my cohort, came in with me to get their PhD.
Wasn't there like 6 or 4 or something?
Well, there were 12,
there were 12.
To start with.
Oh, it went down?
Yes, yeah. After the first statistics class, we were down to 6.
That's it?
Yeah, and then after the preliminary exams and all the coursework and everything, we were down to 4. right?
Hunger Games style.
Well, yeah, it is kind of. It is a
survivor.
little bit, right? And so, a lot of the time, not every school is going to have graduate programs for everything, right? That's the point here, because you're talking about really small numbers. Texas A&M was huge, right? And there were 12 of us, 6 after the first year, 4 after your preliminary exams. They start dropping like flies, right? Okay, so in this situation, Oklahoma didn't have graduate programs at every black school, right?
Yeah.
And so they would allow black graduate students to go to other schools, like the University of Oklahoma, if they couldn't obtain the desired degree at minority schools. All right. Now, once they got there, the university restricted blacks to segregated areas of classrooms, libraries, and dining halls.
Boo.
Yeah. And so are those facilities and opportunities somewhat similar?
Well, apparently, since they thought it was okay.
No, they didn't. They ruled against Oklahoma in this situation. Yeah, absolutely. They ruled for McLaurin. So they ruled for McLaurin, and they said the Oklahoma University system is in violation of the Equal Protection Clause, right? So think about that. Undergraduate experience is different from graduate school. In graduate school, do you interact a lot more with your colleagues? Yes, and actually you collaborate with them, you can co-author papers with them, and that type of thing. I did that while I was in graduate school, co-authored papers and co-presented papers with my colleagues at national conferences. And so, if you're black, how are you going to do that if you have to be in separate parts of the classroom, libraries, and dining halls?
You can't.
You cannot, exactly. So the court said unconstitutional. So is Thurgood Marshall winning?
Yeah.
Yes, yes, he's winning case after case. Okay, so in each one of the cases that we looked at, the facilities or opportunities were not somewhat similar, right? So now Thurgood Marshall decided to go for the jugular, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fight.
Exactly. And this takes us to Brown versus Board of Education 1. Now, most Americans don't realize that there was a Brown versus Board of Education 1 and a Brown versus Board of Education 2. But since this is constitutional law, we will want to distinguish between the two. This is Brown versus Board of Education 1. It was decided in 1954. And, Natalie, why do you think the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, led by Thurgood Marshall, chose the Topeka, Kansas schools and a few other comparable schools?
I don't know, but I assume it was because the difference between the two institutions was very, very different. Yeah. They were just you can't even compare them. They're not even similar. Something that is held in such high prestige, and then something that's so terrible, and you're trying to say that they're the same thing. It doesn't make any sense. So I assume that they chose them because it was so bad versus so good.
The exact opposite.
Never mind that.
Yeah, And that's the strategy, right? They'd been winning when the facilities were very different, right? That's Missouri X-Rail Gaines versus Canada. That's Sweat versus Painter. That's McLaurin versus Oklahoma State Board of Regents. They were very, very different, right? Blacks were clearly disadvantaged. So now that's why they're going for the jugular. They're going for the throat. They're going after the idea that separate educational facilities are constitutional, even if they are the same as it is possible to get at the time. You see the legal strategy?
I do.
Yes, that was the legal strategy. So, this sucks if you're Topeka, Kansas. You're the one that gets hauled into court, and you're like, we were giving the best education we possibly could. And the NAACP will tell you, that's exactly why we're hauling you into court. And because you're a test case, right?
Yeah.
So the schools were as alike in quality as it was possible to find at the time. And that was the strategy. They wanted Plessy versus Ferguson overturned. So case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled for Brown. Yay! It's a huge victory. Brown versus Board of Education won 1954, 9-0. Now, why is it important that it was 9-0?
Because it ain't changing.
It's not changing, exactly. So don't wait for one or two justices on the court to change. We're committed to this, and it's not changing. And it was very important for Earl Warren to get a unanimous ruling, and he did, right? And in his ruling, he wrote the majority opinion. He famously said, separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, right?
Yeah.
So, Natalie, you take math.
Oh, yeah, I do.
What's more, 2 plus 2 or 4?
They're the same.
They're the same. They're equal, right?
Yeah.
So, there's no difference between the two, right?
Nope. Not in value.
So, if you tell one student you're going over here because of your skin color, and you tell another student you're going over here because of your skin color, right? Matthew, I'm recording. So to go back to the example, if you tell someone 2 plus 2 over here or 4 over here, are they equal?
Yeah.
Yes. So if you tell someone you're going to this school because of your race and you're going to this school because of your race, are you being treated equally?
No.
No. Right? So I've always liked Earl Warren's reasoning here. He said separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. If I'm making distinctions between people, then that is not what it means to be equal. Right? So, okay. Now, let's discuss more of... Well, let's tie things back to Plessy versus Ferguson. Remember, just to be clear here, in Brown versus Board of Education, the court directly overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, right? Directly overturned it. But let's look at something else here. In Plessy versus Ferguson, the court deferred to the state's police powers, right?
Yeah.
And the state of Louisiana said this is a legitimate exercise of the state's police powers, right? Well, in Brown versus Board of Education, the little girl, Brown, she had to travel quite a distance to get to the segregated facility, including crossing railroad tracks, which were very dangerous.
Yeah.
Right? So, is the state really protecting the health, safety, and welfare of its citizens by having segregated schools?
No.
No. Exactly. Right? So, it's really hard to make that argument when probably the most dangerous thing that's going to happen to the girl that day is transportation to a segregated school that's farther away than the neighborhood school, right? But anyway, what else do you know about Brown versus Board of Education? What have you heard about it in school or have been taught about it?
They don't teach us anything that's controversial. So
Oh, really?
I don't know anything about it.
They kind of sidestep it?
Yeah.
Okay, well, you know something about it now.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. Well, that takes us to Brown versus Board of Education 2, which was decided in 1955. At the end of Brown versus Board of Education 1, the court invited the attorneys back. Invited. They asked the attorneys back a year from then to argue the issue of remedies. Right? Okay, there you go.
Come with your best ideas.
Yeah, come with your best ideas. We'll see you next year, right?
Yeah.
And so, Brown versus Board of Education 2, 1955, also 9-0. The court said school authorities have the primary responsibility for elucidating, assessing, and solving these local school problems. Right?
Yeah.
So, by definition, who are closest to the local public schools?
The local people.
The local people, exactly. So they said local authorities should oversee how you're going to segregate these facilities, right?
Yes.
And they said, Michael, would you mind coming here for a second?
Mm-hmm.
You want to listen to? Or
I'm listening.
Okay. They said, basically, we're going to leave it to the locals. And the local courts, which originally heard the cases, will have to consider whether the action of school authorities constitutes good faith implementation. Right? And they were not given any timetable. Right? So they didn't say the schools have to be integrated after 2 years or 4 years. They just said integrate your schools with all deliberate speed. All right?
Yeah.
Integrate your school systems with all deliberate speed, but no timetable. So what does it mean when someone says, I'm a deliberate reader?
Take your time.
You take your time, you're careful. You don't just read stuff hastily, right? So integrate your schools with all deliberate speed. So do it carefully, but try to do it quickly as well. How many years is that then, Michael?
I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And so the policy of the schools in the South, the states that were part of the old Confederacy, was to not integrate their schools. They would just say, oh, we're getting on that. We're...
procrastinating.
Yeah, they were. That was the strategy. And so they just wouldn't integrate the schools. But the court didn't give them a timetable, and a lot of scholars have said that one of the reasons why the court didn't give them a timetable was so that Earl Warren could get a unanimous ruling. And so it was kind of a political compromise. You know, people sometimes forget the court isn't just a legal institution, it's a political institution as well. And Earl Warren, the political side of him, very much wanted a unanimous ruling. And so the legal side of him maybe kind of allowed states a little too much wiggle room, But there you go. So the court felt that leaving it to local courts was best because of the proximity to local conditions, possible need for further hearings, etc. Okay. Any questions on Brown versus Board of Education 2 then, Nat?
No.
No. Okay. That takes us to Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education, 1971, 9-0.
You were alive during this.
Yeah, I was. I was born in 1970. So, basically, the court was looking at a number of issues in this case, but the most important and the most politically volatile and confrontational was court-ordered busing.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yes.
Yes. Busing led to a lot of conflict and opposition, right? So, let me ask you a question, Natalie.
Okay, Carl.
If you were a state that had a segregated school system for a long time,
Yes.
right? Say like Alabama,
Mm-hmm.
did that probably affect housing patterns?
Yes.
Yes. Where do you think white people probably bought homes?
By the white school.
By the white school. Exactly. Where do you think African Americans probably bought homes?
By the African Americans.
By the African American school. Exactly. So, years later, were those neighborhoods probably still pretty white or pretty black?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so, a number of cases reached the court dealing with when was court-ordered busing constitutional in order to make school systems racially
Diverse.
balanced and diverse. Yeah. Okay. So here it's important to talk about two terms. One is de jure segregation, and the other is de facto segregation. De jure segregation means from the law. Goes back to Latin. And did states maintain segregated school facilities for a long time before Brown versus Board of Education by law?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely, right? But basically with Brown versus Board of Education, segregated school systems by law were no longer constitutional, right?
Yep.
Okay? But then there was also what's known as de facto segregation, which means from the deed or from the act, right? Yeah. And so, say you have a very wealthy neighborhood, like Beverly Hills.
Ooh.
Yeah, Beverly Hills. And say the school is 100% white.
Yep.
Right? Well, is it white because there's a law requiring it that it be 100% white? Or is it white because all the kids that live in Beverly Hills are white?
The latter.
The latter, right? Exactly. So, I did a lot of my research when I was at Texas A&M on the border in Texas, right?
Yes.
Where there's some school systems down there that were 100% Hispanic.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, 100% Hispanic. I'd go in there, and like I said, I was the only white face in the place, right? Mm-hmm. Well, was there a law requiring that the school be Hispanic, or was just the neighborhood 100% Hispanic?
The neighborhood was 100% Hispanic.
100% down there at the border, absolutely. So, in Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education, they were looking at when certain remedies were appropriate. And again, the most important remedy was court-ordered busing in order to overcome racial imbalances. And the court said, as with any equity case, the nature of the violation determines the scope of the remedy. Right? If school authorities fail to offer acceptable remedies, a district court has broad power to fashion a remedy that will assure a unitary school system. Judicial authority enters only when local authority defaults. So, if the locals are making a good faith effort to integrate their schools, then in theory, will the courts get involved?
Yes. No.
No. Let me repeat it again. If the locals are making a good faith effort to integrate their schools, will the courts get involved?
No.
No. Right? It's only when there have been active efforts to maintain a segregated system that the federal courts are supposed to get involved. So the court said judicial powers may be exercised only on the basis of a constitutional violation. So basically, they said de jure segregation, when there's been segregation by law,
Yeah.
then the courts can come in. You can have court-ordered busing. If you've had de jure segregation at some point. And that's why you still have segregated school systems. So again, use the example of Alabama. Let's just stay with the Alabama example for a while. We had a segregated school system for a long time by law, right? Okay? Well, if all the whites live over here and all the blacks live over here, and you say, oh, now just go to your local school, well, if this area is 100% white, what's the local school going to be?
100% white?
100% white, exactly. So the court in Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg said, if the racial imbalances are the result of any past or continuing official government action, then judicial authority can be taken to correct things, including reassignment of faculty, redrawing of district lines, and busing. Busing being the big one.
Yeah.
Make sense?
Yep.
Now they said where the result is just where the racial imbalances are just the result of neighborhood housing patterns, de facto segregation, then judicial authority should not enter. Make sense?
Yep.
Yep. So, to give an example, you're just going to have to picture this. LA County is right here, since I don't have a chalkboard. Ventura County, where my parents live, is right here. Here's LA County. Here's Ventura County right next to it. In LA County, there was a history of official action that led to racial imbalances, right? So they had court-ordered busing in LA County, right? Mm-hmm. In Ventura County, no history of official action that led to racial imbalances.
And that's why the Ventura lifeguards are a lot more chill.
Well, I don't know. Could be. But say you were a parent in LA County, and say you were a white parent in LA County,
Okay.
and you didn't want your child bused to a different school that's farther than your local school. You wanted your child to go to your local school, but you've been told, sorry, it's racially imbalanced. They're going to be bused to this other school across town. How would you feel about that if you were a white parent?
Well, I'm sending Jeremy to private school then.
Now, private school is an option. It's an option. It's really expensive.
Well,
it's
then
assuming
I will move to Ventura.
Well, there you go. Now that's the real option, right?
What do you mean? My private school was a real option.
Yeah, that can be really expensive, especially depending on how many kids you have. Yeah, okay. and the schools are expensive in LA.
The schools are expensive, and I was rich.
Well, yeah, that's a lot of hypotheticals. Anyway, what this court decision wound up leading to was what some scholars have called white flight. A lot of white people that didn't want their kids bused just moved to neighboring counties where there was no history of official action, government action, that led to racial imbalances. So, if a lot of white people leave LA County, move to Ventura County, then what happened to the number of minorities at LA County School? Percentage of the students that were minority.
It went up.
It went up, right? And so the racial imbalances actually increased after court-ordered busing, and a lot of it was because of this ruling here. Because a lot of people wanted cross-district busing, and people in Ventura County are like, no way. We moved here to be close to schools. We're not having our kids bus across county lines.
It's impractical, too.
Well, also, yeah, schools were spending a ton of money on transportation, right? And they're like, this is a non-instructional expense. I mean, I could understand if we were spending it on good teachers or better books or technology. Yeah, but this is money that's literally burned up in the form of gasoline. And we don't have much to show for it at the end of the year other than a lot of miles logged back and forth. And so that's why a lot of even civil rights advocates said, busing was just a failed public policy. We ought to concentrate more on making the local schools good rather than busing to other schools. Now, again, some people say busing was great for them. Didn't Kamala Harris in the last presidential election say that she was bused and it worked for her? I don't know. You hear different stories from different places. But the court in Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg, it was pretty clear. Judicial powers may be exercised only on the basis of a constitutional violation. So some official action has to have led to the racial imbalances in order for court-ordered busing to occur. Make sense?
Yes.
All right. Well, students, as always, it's been a pleasure. Stay healthy, and we will see you for the next lecture.